Welcome to another teaching on Father-Son theology. In this session, we are teaching on general eschatology. There's actually two parts to this. This is part 2 to general eschatology. In a previous session, part 1 of this, I was teaching progressive view versus dispensational view. I explained how when we read the Bible through a progressive lens, we see God progressively working out His will in the earth, confidently bringing things to the position where every knee will bow to King Jesus. When we read the Bible through a dispensational lens, we break all of time into distinct blocks of time. And most Christians have been profoundly influenced by dispensational thinking, but I would hope to encourage you to also see the progressive view, that God, even though He intervenes and acts with short-term goals, He does everything with an ultimate long-term goal of summing up all things in Christ Jesus. So, I'm now going to apply that to Daniel chapter 9. If you read the Bible through the progressive versus the dispensational, you end up understanding this accordingly. In Daniel chapter 9, Daniel is praying to God about his people, the Jews. The Jews were in captivity, and Daniel prays, when will my people get free, and what is the future of my people? That prayer takes over half of the chapter here in Daniel chapter 9. Then the angel Gabriel, appears to Daniel and gives an answer. And the answer he gives, beginning in verse 24 of Daniel 9, has profound implications for our eschatology, understanding what's going to happen in the future. So I'll read Gabriel's words starting in verse 24. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people, your holy city. Okay, 70 weeks. Important time period there. 70 and times a week. A week has 7 days. 70 times 7 is 490. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're progressive or dispensational. We all agree that the angel has just said the Jews have 490. And we also believe that it's 490 years. The reason is because in prophetic terminology, days often represent years. Like when Laban tells his son-in-law, you have to work for 7 days to have my daughter. Well, it was actually 7 years. Well, there are several examples like that, and I've listed them in the book Father-Son Theology, but it doesn't matter whether you're progressive or dispensational. We agree that's how prophetic language was in Hebrew thought, that the Jews have been told by the angel that they will have 490 years of God working among them, God's favor, and then he goes on in this verse and explains what they're to accomplish in those 490 years. 70 weeks, verse 24, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Okay, Jewish people, you have 490 years. The next verse tells us when it will begin, when the 490 years begins. Verse 25. So that you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there'll be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Okay, we'll break this down. It doesn't matter whether progressive or dispensational. History has plain facts on the kingdoms that had been and around the time of Jesus. There was the Babylonian kingdom, the Medo-Persian kingdom, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. Doesn't matter, progressive or dispensational, we agree those are historical facts. The Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Greek, and the Roman. That these were in succession, these 4 empires. The Jews were in captivity in Babylon, and in the year 457 BC, a decree was issued that the Jews could go free. The Jews being in captivity were told, now you can leave, you can go free, you can go back. The book of Nehemiah is about that. It's about the Jews leaving one area and going back to build the walls around the city of Jerusalem. But we also have Esther and Zechariah and some of the other smaller books that talk about the people who are exiled coming back to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So there's this mass migration of Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls and the temple. The first decree was 457 BC. Jews, you're free. Exactly as the angel had said. But the angel said from that decree, there's going to be a certain time pass. Let's read again, verse 25. So you're to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, right here, that date, from that date, until Messiah, until Jesus, the Prince, there'll be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Let's see, 7 weeks and 62 weeks. That's 69 weeks, 7 days. There'll be 483 years. So the angel has just said, from that decree, you add on 483. You know where you come to? Come to the year 27. Again, doesn't matter whether you are progressive or dispensational in your view of reading the scriptures, you will understand this incredible prophecy. See, the year 27 is the year Jesus stepped out and began his public ministry. He began his public ministry, fasting for 40 days, being water baptized by John the Baptist, coming into Jerusalem, reading from Isaiah, and saying, today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. That was the year 27. Jesus begins his 3.5-year ministry, starting right then. Amazing. This prophecy was given several hundred years before Jesus was born, came into the earth. Now he's going to go on. The important point here now is we agree, progressive and dispensational, about 483 years. But notice we still have 7 years left over. 490 years were given to the Jews. We've used up 483. During 483 years, the Jews were able to go back to the promised land, build the temple, build the city. God had God's favor. But now they have 7 years left, 7 more years of the Jewish favor. That's where we disagree. We agree about the first part, but these last 7 years, that's where it really becomes interesting. Okay, it's verse 27 that talks about this last week, the last 7 years. It's called Daniel's 70th week. Verse 27, and he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he'll put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. Okay, that tells us about this 1 week, the 7-year period. It says in the middle of it, at the 3.5-year mark, there's going to be a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. Okay, if you read the Bible through the dispensational lens, again, you're thinking in dispensations. The Jews rejected Jesus. And as I explained in part 1 of this session, we talked about how thinking in dispensations, the end of the Jewish age began the church age, or the time when God was working with Gentiles to be saved. That the next dispensation was the dispensation of the Gentiles. Well, we know the Jews still have 7 years of favor. When will that be? If you read the Bible through dispensational lens, you see that God worked with the Jews from Abraham on up, but now there's 7 years still promised. So at some point in the future, dispensationalists say the Jews are going to get a 7-year period of favor. Now they add a lot of other scriptures to build up what's going to happen to those 7 years, and we're going to talk about that. They envision even if the whole world comes against Israel, God is going to save Israel by war after war, battle after battle. God's going to give the Jews favor, raise them up as a powerful nation in the earth, that the Jews must have this 7 years of favor because they have not had it yet. So at some point in the future that will happen. In the middle of the 7 years, the angel said he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. Now, we talked in the previous session how dispensational thinking leads us to believe that there'll be a revived Roman Empire. And when Jesus comes back, he'll destroy that revived Roman Empire. It's an evil empire. So when they're dispensational trying to put together these various pieces, they usually come to conclude that he is the Antichrist. The Antichrist, somehow tied in with this evil Roman Empire, the Antichrist will make a covenant with the Jewish people. He'll go to Jerusalem, make a covenant, but in the middle of the 7-year period, he's going to violate things. He's somehow going to put a stop to animal sacrifices. He's going to put a stop to the religious practice of the Jews. And it's going to be a catastrophic event. Okay? Now, even by what's implied here, the Antichrist going to the temple and stopping the animal sacrifices, that implies that the temple is going to be rebuilt. Okay? So dispensationalists believe the temple in Jerusalem must be rebuilt, the Jews raised up as a mighty nation. Now come up here the progressive view. If you're not thinking in blocks of time, you're thinking God's progressively working out his will in the earth. There's a much more natural reading of Daniel chapter 9. Indeed, the Jews were given 483 years already back here. They still have 7 more years. But instead of seeing a Gentile dispensation, a year gap of over 2,000 years, let's place the 7 years immediately after the year 27. Let's just see, because there is nothing in Daniel 9 that implies there's a 2,000 year gap. But if we put immediately as it reads here, progressively, step, the Jews were given 483 years, they have 7 more years, let's put it right there and see what happens. Well, the interesting thing is that at the 3.5 year mark, you see what happened. Year 27 plus 3.5 years. And where that brings you? Brings you to Passover, when Jesus died on the cross. When Jesus died on the cross, he put an end to sacrifice and grain offerings. You see, when Jesus gave his life, he was the high priest. He was the final lamb, the perfect lamb. God no longer wanted the Jewish religious system. He no longer wants people to approach him through animal sacrifices. Jesus is the only way to the Father. Jesus put an end to animals and sacrifices and all of that Jewish religious system. Notice how different this is than down here. Dispensationalists conclude it's the Antichrist. Up here, a progressive understanding would lead you to believe that it's Jesus Christ who puts an end to sacrifice and grain offering. But now we still have another 3.5 years. After Jesus died on the cross, there's 3.5 more years, during which time the Jews should have favor. They should have special privileges. And what do we see after Jesus died? We go 3.5 years. No one can prove on a calendar exactly what happened, because we don't have historical records of exactly this happened, this happened, this happened. But we can get pretty close. And 3.5 years from the death of Jesus brings us somewhere around Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7 is when Stephen gets stoned to death. And the significance of that was that the high priest was the one who was overseeing it. The high priest, the one who's supposed to be most holy, the one who represents all of Israel, is the one overseeing as Stephen gets stoned to death. This Christian who was declaring the good news, and the Jewish high priest, who represents all of Israel, puts a final rejection and says, stone him. It was a very, historic event. Not just because Stephen was put to death, but because of the implications of the rejection of Jesus Christ. Okay? Immediately after Acts chapter 7, what do we have? Chapter 8, Paul gets struck by light. He was persecuting Christians. God says that's enough. And Jesus tells him, you are my chosen vessel to speak to the Gentiles. Notice the transition from the Jews to the Gentiles. In the first part of Acts, the disciples said, we must first preach to the Jews. That's what Jesus commissioned to them, to the Jews first. That wasn't true up until Acts 7. Chapter 8, God strikes Paul, puts him on a different course. He's called to speak to the Gentiles. Chapters 10, God reveals himself to Peter. A sheet lowers down, and on this sheet are all kinds of unclean animals. A voice says, come and eat, Peter. Peter refuses, but then he gets the understanding that all these unclean things represent the Gentiles, and God says, no longer call unclean what I have declared clean. Peter goes and talks to the other apostles and the other church leaders and explains, it's time now. God wants us to declare the good news to the entire world. So, indeed, the Jews had 7 years of favor, 3.5 years of Jesus walking among them, his very presence, and another 3.5 years with the apostles walking among them. Then it opened up for the gospel to preach to the whole world. Notice this 7 years. According to this way of thinking, the Jews have already had their 7 years of favor. It happened back then. Down here, the Jews still have a 7-year period in the future. So this has strong implications about what you believe about the future of the Jews. Now, this way of thinking is now going to come to our New Testament thoughts. If I erase this middle part to make room for how we're going to understand things here, we're going to see where that 7 years fits in. If you and I would look now at Matthew 24, and the book of Revelations. Both of these are key passages. But we have to now make another distinction in how we interpret it. Rather than thinking in terms of progressive and dispensational, I would like to offer you the words the futurist view and the partial preterist view. Partial preterist view. Partial preterist. These are also theological terms that are especially applicable to this time. I'm sorry, I misspelled preterist there. Sometimes as I'm talking and thinking, I misspell things. Preterist. There we go. Partial preterist. Now, if you read the Bible through the dispensational lens, you will come up with a futurist view. Futurist means of the future. Therefore, when you read Matthew 24 and the book of Revelations, you will place the events that are told about there in the future, the futurist view. In particular, you will have in mind this 7-year period in the future. That during this 7 years, there's going to be a great tribulation. But also, it's a key time because the dispensation of the church in dispensational thinking comes right up to that day, and now God's going to turn his favor back to the Jews. So you think in your mind that this 7 years is particularly for the Jews. They're going to rebuild their temple. Israel's going to rise to the top. That's what you are expecting. Again, in contrast up here, you read the Bible through the progressive view, you say the Jews already had their 7 years. And yes, God still has a special purpose for the Jews, but it's not to rebuild the temple, nor is it to raise them as a nation above all other nations. Let's see what it talks about here. In Matthew 24, I hope you have a Bible that you can look at. There is a key verse, verse 3. It says, "And as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?'" When dispensationalists read this, they put these questions asking about the future. They're futurist. They see this, the disciples just asked Jesus, and think they just ask him about when will the end of the world be. When dispensationalists read that verse, they're excited to read Jesus' answer because they're thinking the answer is going to be Jesus saying what's going to happen at the end of the world. Where if you read it from what's the partial preterist view. Now, this partial preterist view, it's an easy fit with progressive thinking. I'm always trying to use generalized terms because dispensationalism does not have to lead to futurist view, but it's the easiest fit. It's where most people go. The progressive view doesn't have to go to partial preterism, but it's an easy fit. It's usually where they go. Futurist means of the future. Preterist means of the past. Partial means part of the past. When we explain these, we will be explaining that futurist sees the book of Revelations be fulfilled in our future. When we look at partial preterist, we're going to say that the book of Revelations, part of it is fulfilled in the future and part of it in the past. Same thing here in Matthew 24. With the partial preterist view, we are going to understand this, and I'll explain it to you. Part of Matthew 24 is fulfilled in the past and part of it in the future. Part past. Partial preterist. Futurist. Okay? Most Christians in the United States have been raised in dispensational thinking. Therefore, their mind is already programmed to think that the book of Revelations will be fulfilled in the future and Matthew 24 will be fulfilled in the future. Therefore, verse 3, where the disciples asked Jesus the question, "Tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age?" In their mind, they think they just asked Jesus, when will the end of the world be? Okay? Therefore, the answer Jesus gives, that's the entire rest of chapter 24, has to happen in the future. And if you let your eyes just kind of scan down here, beginning of verse 4, he talks about people claiming to be Christ, wars, rumors of war, famines and earthquakes, tribulation, preaching the gospel around the world, then this destruction hitting Judea, great tribulation. Then we see the stars darkening, the stars not giving their light, the coming of the Son of Man. And then we see, be ready, for one will be taken, one will be left. It'll be just as the days of Noah. That's the type of description, and dispensational thinking leads you to believe it will be fulfilled in the future. that before the 7 years, there's going to come a tribulation. It's going to work up to the point of a great tribulation. Most futurists believe that the Gentiles will be raptured off the earth before the 7-year tribulation. Now, not all of them believe that. Some of them will say the rapture is until after the 7 years. But the easiest fit is to see the Gentiles being taken off the earth before the Great Tribulation. That's because they already have in their mind that we are in the dispensation of the church, the Gentiles, and when the church is done with, God is now done saving Gentiles, then he's going to deal with Jews. Therefore, the Gentile Christians can get out of here. They can get removed because the dispensation of Gentiles is over, so we can take them up. Then the judgments that are in the book of Revelations will come on the earth during a 7-year great tribulation. That's the unfolding of events that's envisioned. It's just a natural fit if we are reading the Bible through dispensational thinking. If we have a partial preterist view, there's a whole other factor that has to come involved. You see, here, let me read the question, verse 3 again, but let's look at it with different eyes. And Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming, the end of the age?" Partial preterists like to point out that it's not one question, but 3 different questions are here. 3 questions, not one question. Question number 1, tell us when these things will happen. Question number 2, what will be the sign of your coming? Question number 3, what about the end of the age? The King James puts end of the world. Doesn't matter which one, for our sakes, use age or world. The Greek word aeon can be translated either way. The important point is there's 3 questions, not one. First question, when will these things happen? Okay, what are these things that the disciples were asking about? The futurists are assuming they're asking about the end of the world. But before we jump to that conclusion, it's best to read the context to see what they're asking about. And if you read the context, you have to go back chapter 23, the preceding chapter. If you have a red letter edition of Bible, that means all the words of Jesus in red, you will notice that the entire chapter 23, except the first line, is in red. This is Jesus in Jerusalem in the temple. First, in the temple, he talks to his disciples, and he warns his disciples about the Jewish religious leaders. That goes from verse 1 down to verse 12. Then Jesus turns from his disciples, he faces the scribes and Pharisees, and begins to rebuke them. And that's what the rest of the chapter is about. Let me give you the flavor of this by just saying the first few words of some of these verses. Verse 13, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. 14, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. 16, woe to you, blind guides. Verse 17, you fools and blind men. Okay, these are considered, the Jewish religious leaders were thought by the Jews to be the most holy men on earth. Now they're in the most holy location, in Jerusalem, in the temple on earth, and Jesus is calling these people hypocrites, fools, blind men. I'll jump a few verses down. Verse 23, get the flavor of this. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. 24, you blind guides. 25, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. 26, you blind Pharisee. 27, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Now, it comes up to a crescendo, getting even worse, when he starts saying in verse 29, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You build the tombs of the prophets and adorns the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with him in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How will you escape the sentence of hell? Jesus has just said that to the men who are considered most holy in Judaism. How will you escape the sentence of hell? Then he declares destruction on them and the city. Verse 34. Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you'll kill and crucify. Some of them you'll scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Bechariah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jesus just declared the blood of every righteous person in your holy book is going to come upon you and your generation. You will be held accountable. You, religious leaders standing right before me, in your generation. And in Jewish thought, a generation was considered 40 years. Within 40 years, this judgment is going to come. Then verse 37, Jesus turning, not just specifically at the Pharisees. Now he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. Now he's talking to the whole city. Who kills the prophets and those who are sent to her. Often I wanted to gather together your children, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. Behold, your home is left to you desolate. He has just said, you see this place? Your house will be desolated. It will be destroyed. Then Jesus walks out of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, to understand the Bible, you can't stop at a chapter heading, chapter 24. You have to keep on reading because these numbers have been added later. It was originally written straight through. So, chapter 24, verse 1, and Jesus came out from the temple. So now it's continually walk out of the temple and was going away when the disciples came out to point the temple buildings to him. So the disciples want to get out of there too. They're running behind him. Jesus walks out and they point to the temple buildings. I'm going to ask him a question, but before they can, verse 2, and Jesus said to him, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. Jesus said, you see this temple? Not one stone here will be left which will not be torn down. That very temple they're looking at. Verse 3. And as he was sitting in Mount of Olives. Mount of Olives is, even today, you can go over there. It's just outside of Jerusalem. It's a little hill. I've sat on it. Been there more than once. And you're looking right at the temple. And there you see the temple. The disciples were sitting next to Jesus. And what's the first question? Tell us, when will these things happen? You see, Parsha Preteris, and in fact, most of the historic church, when we talk in history, we're talking about the leaders in history preceding the last 100 years. Most of our church fathers before the last 100 years commonly agreed that the first question was not about the end of the world, it was about when will the temple in Jerusalem be destroyed. Jesus said within 40 years of that date. Jesus made this declaration around the year 30, to the best of our understanding, the year 30. Add 40 years to that and you come to 70 AD. Some of you know your history, some of you don't. The year 70 AD is when Jerusalem was destroyed. The armies of Rome were led by the general to encircle Rome on the hills around Rome, to cut the city off and to starve the people till there was no more food. Then they came down and destroyed the city. They came into the temple. There was, the historical records tell us about 2,000 people were in the temple. They slit the throats of all those people. They lit the temple on fire. The gold that was in the dome on the top melted into the rocks. And because of that, later on, it was commanded that every rock would be removed one at a time so they could recapture the gold. And then it was plowed over. Jesus said, not one stone will be left upon another. It'll happen within one generation. That was literally fulfilled in 70 AD. Over 1 million Jews were killed. That was the first Holocaust. Now, many Christians don't even know about that. You see, if you knew about that, if that was part of your understanding, you might question the futurist view. If the futurist spent time talking much about this, it might open up the can of worms that they don't want opened up. But it is a historical fact that this was fulfilled exactly as Jesus said. Now, when the disciples were sitting with Jesus, the first question, when will these things happen? Parsha Preteris and people like me believe part of these verses in Matthew 20 were already fulfilled. We believe part of it was fulfilled in 70 AD. We still believe in the second coming of Jesus. We still believe that there's many things to be fulfilled in the future in the book of Revelations, but we believe part of the things that were prophesied were fulfilled here in 70 AD. What part? Jesus answers the three questions. He answers question number 1, when will these things happen? In verse 4 down to verse 28. Okay, let's go back in verse 3. Read the questions. Tell us, when will these things happen? Question number 2, what will be the sign of your coming? Question number 3, what about the end of the age of the world? 3 questions. The way this is most commonly understood by partial preterists, verses 4 to 28 is question number 1. Verses 29 to 35 is question number 2. And verse 36 to the end of the chapter is question number 3. Now, there are varieties how each verse would be explained this way or that way, and we certainly can't take all their varieties here. I co-authored a book with Pastor Martin Trench called Victorious Eschatology. We talk a lot more in depth, but the book Father Son Theology, even though it's very thick, it cannot deal with all the variations on eschatology. We're just trying to hit the main point, especially in this discussion right now that I'm presenting to you. The two main points, partial preterist and futurist. There's also another view called full preterist, which they think all has been fulfilled in 70 AD, all the prophecies, and there's no longer any of the book of Revelation in the future. Now, I respect people who have that view, but I don't have it. I have a hard time, even giving it credence, because I don't believe it's true to the scriptures. So I'm limiting this discussion to the partial preterist and the futurist view. But if you are more interested, I even have a book written on the difference between the partial preterist and the full preterist view called His Comings. You could also check out that. Right now, let's just develop this just a little bit more. The futurist believe all the book of Revelation is for the future. The partial preterist says part of the book of Revelation is fulfilled in the future, part of it's in the past. Same thing with Matthew 24. Part of Matthew 24 was fulfilled in 70 AD, part of it remains to be fulfilled in the future. So here, in Matthew 24, verse 4 to 28, is the first question. But this is where Jesus says, many will come claiming to be the Christ. He talks about famines and earthquakes, false prophets, calls about tribulation. And this is the passage that he's answering the first question. So partial preterists believe that the tribulation that is talked about in Matthew 24 were the events leading up to 70 AD. Now, it's difficult to emphasize how cruel and terrible that was. There was a writer named Josephus who was present at that time in history. He was a Jewish rabbi hired by the Roman government. He was among the soldiers surrounding the city, documenting what was going on. You can read that. The book's called Josephus. Josephus is the name of that rabbi. And you could Google it and find it, just Josephus. He records what happens. He talks about the famines. He talks about how terrible people were fighting one another, killing one another within Jerusalem. Food was so bad. The Roman army surrounding the city, they were instructed that anybody tried to sneak out to get by them. First they cut open their stomach to look for gems while they're alive, because Jews were known to swallow gems and then try to escape to carry gems with them. That went on for several months. Then the general changed it and said he wants them just to cut off their hands and send them back into the city. Anybody who tried to escape, their hands were cut off, sent back into the city. That went on for several months. Finally, Josephus describes how when the order was given to descend upon these starving people, the starving city, that they began crucifying the Jews. More than 500 per day were crucified, till there was no longer any places left without a body hanging. Then they came into the city. They slaughtered everyone. Over 1 million Jews were killed. 97,000 approximately were taken away as slaves to work in salt mines or to be killed in the Colosseums. And then finally they went into the temple and slit the throats of 2,000 or so. The dome burned, and later on every rock was removed, exactly as Jesus said. The important point being that that part of the prophecies were literally fulfilled by 70 AD. Partial preterists see it happening then. Partial preterists, part in the past, part of the prophecies. So I'm not going to take the time to go through the rest of Matthew 24. I'd encourage you to read Father Son Theology. More importantly, if you want to get into it, there's a lot of books out right now about this understanding. You could also read mine, Victorious Eschatology, that I co-authored with Pastor Martin Trench. Would you go to the book of Revelations with me? Let's just take a minute to look at the book of Revelations, how it is viewed differently by these two views. In order to simplify my pictures, I'll get rid of some of this lettering here. I hope that you can still make sense of my pictures that are happening along here. We still have year 0 here. Christ was on the earth. We're now going to talk about the book of Revelations, how it's understood. My Bible's open to Revelation chapter 1. Partial preterists and futurists, they have pretty much agreement about chapter 1. Jesus appeared to John. John has this incredible encounter with Jesus Christ. There's some small things that might be understood differently, but That's the primary message. John sees Jesus. Chapters 2 and 3, there are 7 letters to 7 churches. Those churches existed in the first century. Partial preterists and futurists would agree. 7 letters to 7 churches. But now, starting chapter 4, verse 1, we disagree about everything. This is where the real difference comes. Beginning chapter 4, verse 1, after the 7 letters are written to 7 churches, chapter 4, verse 1, I want to read these 2 verses, verse 1 and 2. Chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. After these things I looked, I as John. John looked, and behold, a door stand open in heaven, and the first voice which I heard, like the sound of a trumpet speaking, we said, Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, the throne was standing in heaven, and one sitting on the throne. So, John said, heard a voice, come up here. The voice then says, I will show you what must take place in the future. That's what's written here. Now, if you're a futurist, you believe these events happen in the future. So, there's something about a come up here. Most futurists see John chapter 4, verse 1 and 2 is when the church is raptured to heaven. That come up here is the call of Jesus to bring the church off of the earth so that the rest of the book of Revelations, especially chapter 4 to chapter 18, when destruction is being talked about, there's judgments from chapter 4 to chapter 18 that they will come to earth, and the Christian Gentiles will not have to be on earth to experience it. That God said, come up here so the Christians can be in heaven while the judgments of chapters 4 through 18. So with the futurist view, Revelations 4:1 is the rapture. But here, it's 7-year period of judgments brings us all the way up through chapter 18. Then in chapter 19, Jesus returns. This is chapter 19. Okay, so if you're trying to understand the book of Revelations through the futurist view, which is when you read the Bible through dispensational thinking, the best fit is the futurist view. That is the most predominant public teaching in Christian radio, especially in my country, and Christian television. Most of the most prominent teachers are just teach the futurist view. That the church will be raptured to heaven, there'll be a 7-year tribulation, and that's when the book of Revelations from chapter 4 to 18, all the judgments happen. Then Jesus returns in chapter 19. And then in chapter 20, there's a millennial reign, 1,000-year reign of Jesus. Then there's a new heavens and new earth. Okay? Now, contrast that with the partial preterist view. I believe the partial preterist part of the book of Revelations is already fulfilled. I read chapter 4, verse 1, and say, after these things I looked, and behold, the door standing open in heaven. The first voice which I heard, like this trumpet speaking, we said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things. That the voice that said, come up here, was not speaking to the whole church. It was speaking to John. John heard the voice. That this was not something in our future, but when John was alive on the earth, he got to experience Jesus Christ. He had an encounter with Jesus while John was alive in the first century. And the voice said, come up here. John was taken to heaven and told, John, I will show you what must take place in the future. That you get to see everything that's going to happen in the future. Therefore, chapter 4, verse 1 happened in the first century. Then John got to see everything that's happened in the future. Therefore, the judgments that happen from chapter 4 to chapter 18 are not something in the future compressed into a 7-year period, but there's something that happened after John's taken into heaven. Now, partial preterists see chapter 7 to 11 as the judgment of Jerusalem. By 70 AD, that is fulfilled. That when we read chapter 7, Revelation 7 to 11, we're seeing God's beginning judgment. Judgments begin with the Jews. And that's why in chapter 7, first, there's 144,000 who are sealed. There are 12,000 from the tribe of Judah, 12,000 from the other tribe, each of the other tribes. 12,000, 12,000, 12,000, because what? These were sealed so they wouldn't be killed. That judgment was coming upon the Jews, but God was sparing a remnant, 144,000. Doesn't have to be an exact number to the Jews. It just meant a sufficient number so there'd be remnants so they wouldn't all be destroyed. But then the destruction that we see, the set of judgments from chapter 7 to 11, is the judgment upon the Jews. In chapter 11, we see the temple being destroyed, exactly as Jesus prophesied that it would be destroyed in 70 AD. Now, partial preterists disagree about how the rest of the prophecies are actually fulfilled. You see the word partial preterist, part in the past? The problem with that label is it doesn't tell us what parts in the past and what parts in the future. So different partial preterists see different parts in the past. We all agree that chapters 11 to 11 is about Jerusalem. But from 11 to 18, where are those judgments? Okay? People like me see also that Rome was to be judged. That Rome was to be judged. And people like me say chapters 12 to 14 is when the judgments are poured out in Rome. And then there's a third set of judgments beginning in chapters 15 to 18, and I see those coming upon all the world. Now, some of my partial preterist friends say all these judgments are just talking about the judgment of Jerusalem. And then Jesus returns in chapter 19. Yes, he returns, praise God. Then there is a millennial reign. Yes, and then there's a new heavens and new earth. So, I'm saying that concerning the judgments that happen from chapter 12 to 18, there's a lot of disagreements, and I think I'm right, but I honor the other people who have valid arguments, okay? I don't want to base anything significant, because you can disagree about end-time events and still love each other. In fact, the brother who co-authored the book with me, Victorious Eschatology, we disagree on this issue, okay? We all agree chapters 7 to 11 is the judgment of Jews. But what about the rest? Who is being judged in these chapters? Okay, the most significant thing, though, is Revelations is spread out over the course of at least 2,000 years. Instead of these judgments being compressed into a 7-year period in the future, they're spread out. So we are not looking for some future day when God pours out his wrath on the world and kills most of the world. We're not looking for that. In fact, John was taken to heaven. He was seeing judgments coming in heaven, and they are spiritual judgments attacking spiritual entities. Yes, there are consequences in the natural realm, but what's really being judged is the spiritual powers and authorities. Because the Father said to the Son, when he sat down on the throne, "Sit here, Son, till I make every enemy a footstool for your feet." So what's going on in the book of Revelations is the Father is making every enemy of Jesus bow. I mean, these are arrows putting them down, losing their authority. So that the time Jesus is ready to return, every enemy is made to bow. Then Jesus will come back victorious and set up his total reign, the kingdom of God. Okay, so I'm a partial preterist. Most of my friends have moved. I was trained with the futures view. This is where I was discipled. This is the seminary I attended, held to this view. But through the years of researching and studying, I've come to believe that this is a more accurate view. I explain it in Father-Son theology. Let's quickly, though, to finish up this discussion of general eschatology, jump to the end of the book of Revelations. Okay? Of course, I'm not hitting every verse. This is much too short to do all that. Chapter 19, Jesus returns. Chapter 20, there's a millennial reign. You can take it as literal 1,000 years or not. Then there's a new heavens and new earth. Okay? So after that, there's a new heavens and new earth. And there's an agreement up here, yes. Some of the partial preterists see the new heavens and new earth as the manifestation of God's covenant now. Okay, I'm going to set that aside and relate to you more how I understand it. I believe in a literal new heavens and new earth, that Jesus is going to rule and reign. Then this heaven and earth, the earth we're standing on, the heavens that we look at, the skies, it's going to go through a metamorphosis, that all of creation has been groaning for the revealing of the sons of God, that it has, the earth, back when Adam sinned, was subjected to futility, but creation since that day has been longing for some future day when God's people will rise up and they will manage the earth manage creation the way they were created to manage it, and creation itself is going to go through a transformation, a metamorphosis, like a caterpillar into a butterfly. So Revelation chapter 21, verse 1, then I saw new heavens and a new earth. For the first heavens and first earth passed away, and there's no longer any sea. Now, usually the futurists see this present heaven and earth disappearing, being totally extinguished, and God created a new heavens and a new earth. Okay? It's okay to understand it that way, but there's another possibility that's just as reasonable, and it's the I favorite. When he says, I saw a new heavens and new earth, for the first heavens and earth passed away, the word passed away does not, in the Greek language, mean go out of existence. He then talks about the new heavens and new earth, and he talks about New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. Okay? When the earth goes through this metamorphosis, will God totally extinguish, make this earth go out of existence and create a new earth? Well, it's difficult to just agree to that, because there are some scriptures that imply that the earth is created to exist forever. Now, I'm flipping through here just to try to pick some of the verses, and I hate to distract from my attention giving to you right now, but I think it's worth enough to give attention for at least a couple verses that talk about the earth is forever. Like here's one, okay? Psalm 104 verse 5, he established the earth upon its foundations so that it will not totter forever and ever. Okay, you can also check out Ecclesiastic 1:4. I mean, we have these verses that say God created the earth to exist forever, but then here it says heaven and earth pass away. So we have to somehow mesh those together. There's also one other passage. Peter explains this. So now I'm turning to Peter to read what he says about the earth passing away. It is in 2 Peter chapter 3. Here he explains, verse 10, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. Since all these things are to be destroyed in this way. Okay, if I just read that passage, it sounds like the earth will be destroyed in the sense of going out of existence. But if I read the context, I come to a different understanding. Because earlier, just preceding verses, he talks about the judgment that happened in Noah's day and with the flood, and uses similar terminology. He says, verse 5, for when we maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. He talks about the world was destroyed with water. Now he compares the world will in the future be destroyed by fire. But when it was destroyed by water, it didn't go out of existence. It was destroyed in the sense of evil was washed away. So if we are going to follow this parallel through, we can say, yes, the world will be destroyed by fire, but it's in the sense that evil will be swept away. Then we can remain consistent with the other verses that this earth was created to exist forever. That God is not just redeeming humans, he's redeeming creation. That God, in the beginning, had a plan not just to use creation for a temporary period, but literally to redeem creation and to raise up sons and daughters to rule and reign. And then Jesus will come down and bring New Jerusalem, a city that he's been preparing for us. And Revelations chapter 21 describes this city, saying it's 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles. And he says these are angelic measurements which are the same as human measurements. That statement implies to me that the measurements in the spirit are the same size as the natural. Statements like that imply to me that this is a literal city. And I know many people would agree, and it's fine if you take it figuratively, but from my perspective, I'm envisioning, we'll all find out someday, I'm envisioning a literal city, Jerusalem, coming down to a recreated earth, where there's no more futility, no one has to work by the sweat of their brow, but the earth will be stewarded by the sons and daughters of God, who are in tune with God, who are working with Jesus Christ, who literally will come back to earth, and we, the bride, will rule and reign with him. So, that's the eschatology that I would like to offer to you. Okay? Of course, there's minor things. I miss a lot of little verses that you could be asking about. And I would recommend the books. First of all, Father-Son Theology. There's a whole volume on general eschatology. and then there's other books recommended in there. So please consider from this view, if you have not been exposed to the partial preterist view or the progressive lens, seeing God work out his plans. One final thing I would like to put into this picture is the role of the Jews. I had explained that the Jews rejected Jesus. They had their 7-year period, their 7 years of favor that the angel Gabriel had offered them. But then Paul explains in both Romans 9 and 11, he talks about how the Jews were cut off from the blessing of Abraham. The blessing of Abraham was now flowing through Jesus Christ, but they rejected Jesus Christ. So the Jews were cut off. Now, that doesn't mean that the Jews are neglected and God has discarded them. That's where Christians get confused. You see, when you read Paul's explanation in Romans, especially Romans chapter 11, he says, yes, the Jews rejected Jesus, but then he immediately follows it up and says, but God has not rejected the Jews. The Jews rejected Jesus, so they were cut off from the promises given to Abraham. That's what he says. Yes, they were cut off, but God has not rejected the Jews. And then he goes on, and Paul talks about how the Jews are the natural branches, and he talks about his cry in his heart that the Jews may someday be grafted back into the purposes of God. And here's a key verse in chapter 11 of Romans, verse 28. From the standpoint of the gospel, they're enemies for your sake. Okay? Back here, the Jews were persecuting Christians. They were enemies. Jews were enemies of the gospel back here. So he's talking about these Jews who are enemies. From the standpoint of the gospel, they're enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. Okay? Those ones who are enemies, who are fighting Christians, they are still beloved. God still has a purpose and a plan for them. The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Yes, they rejected Jesus, but God has not rejected them. We don't really know what God's plan is, but it simply gives a hope. Paul's expressing this hope. He's not saying, in fact, he says it's a mystery. He says it's a mystery. We don't know what's going to happen to the Jews, but he is implying that somehow the Jews were hardened for a time so that the gospel could come to Gentiles. But it's implying that their eyes will be opened up, that there's going to come a day in the future when they will recognize Jesus as Savior and be grafted back into the purposes of God. So, nobody knows for sure. It's a mystery, but it's simply on implication. And Paul is talking that Gentile Christians should be careful not to become arrogant against the Jews. We should still honor them for the sake of the fathers, because their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the fathers, are the ones that God chose. God thinks generationally, not just right now. God has blessed my nation because there have been godly people lay the foundation of my nation. God thinks generationally. His loving kindness goes to thousands. You can't think little of that. And Paul is correcting Christians who would look down on the Jews because they rejected Jesus, look down on them and say they're rejected by God. They weren't rejected by God. Yes, they rejected Jesus, but God still has a special place. What is that special place? Okay, partial preterists do not believe that they're going to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. They believe God put an end to the Jewish religious system. How they as a people still have a place in God's heart, and God still has a plan to work out in the future. The details of that we're not talking about now, but I want to be careful that we caution not to take an attitude of negativity toward the Jews. There still is something about the Jewish people. They still as a people have won more Nobel Prizes than any other people on earth. They have had more medical breakthroughs, more technological breakthroughs. There's still something about them. As Paul said, they are a cultured olive tree. There is something in their tradition that God instilled within them, and we should still honor what God honors. Okay? Beyond that, I'm going to have to stop there, although we could talk for a lot longer. God bless you. I hope to see you in some more of these sessions on Father-Son theology.